Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We'll just wait a minute until it gets around to past, and then I'll do some introductions and we'll get going. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David May, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Lincoln Institute for Agri-Food Technology. Welcome to this, the first of our breakfast briefings for the winter 22-23. This is part of also the university's Climate Action Festival, which is showing the university's commitment to supporting climate action, and we're here hosting a number of initiatives this year. And this is to raise awareness about how we can all make a positive change towards helping the environment, and sustainability is the key theme. So I'm delighted to welcome two of my colleagues, Leo Rempolos and Louise Manning, who today are going to talk about sustainability and the particular aspects and views on that. So first of all, Leo is going to talk for about half an hour on producing food with fewer inputs, or producing more food, I should correctly say, with fewer inputs. Leo joined the team recently at Lincoln as a lecturer in sustainable agriculture with a background in crop science and agronomy. He's based now at LIAT, and he's got over 10 years experience in research. Most of his research has been focused on strategies to reduce the environmental impact of crop production, while maintaining and improving crop productivity and nutritional quality in temperate and semi-arid farming systems. So Leo's going to talk about how we can produce more crops with fewer inputs, so our future production systems become more climate resilient. Once Leo's done his talk, then I'm going to invite Professor Louise Manning to do her talk, and I'll introduce her at that point, and then we'll take some questions at the end of it. So the talk's going to last about half an hour each, and then we'll come back and take some questions. If you do have any questions, please put them in the comment section so that we can read them out and comment on them at the end of it. I'm now going to hand over to Leo. Over to you, Leo.
Hello. Can you see my screen? I think you can see my screen. So hello, thanks David for the introduction. I'm Leo, and I'm going to talk about producing more food with less inputs. It's I will present you a logical framework that I actually designed a few years ago based on my previous research outcomes. Starting with, agriculture and food make a vital contribution to the UK's economy and prosperity. The agri-food sector employs about almost 4 million people and contributes to about 110 billion pounds to the local economy. However, as we all know, the global demand for food is rising. It is driven by factors like population growth, increasing wealth, changing diets, and at the same time, there is an increasing competition for land and fresh water, which is adding pressure on the production and the wider environments which the food is produced. Furthermore, climate change, it threatens the food security and nutrition through impact on soil, crop growth, animal survival, and human labor productivity. On the other hand, the contribution of agriculture to climate change, it's mainly associated with carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions, with direct agricultural emissions mainly being dominated by methane and nitrous oxide. In total, the global food system is responsible for up to 37% of the annual emissions, and agricultural activities generating around half of all the anthropogenic methane and around 3/4 of the nitrous oxide emissions. The food system emission, carbon dioxide emissions are really hard to quantify because of the diverse process that they are generated. And I will give you an overview of this in the next slide. A small amount of carbon dioxide emissions occur directly from agricultural production, for example, following the application of urea and urea fertilizers and lime. But these sources constitute an extremely small proportion of the total carbon dioxide. But the food system is the main cause of ongoing land use change and CO2 emissions, primarily from cleaning the land for crop production, like or pasture, like removing the forests. Net land use related CO2 emissions are estimated as being responsible for about 14% of the annual anthropogenic emissions, with 10% directly linked to agriculture. On the other hand, energy use, CO2, carbon dioxide, from either agricultural operations like tractor use, the fuel that farmers use, or the inputs that we use, like the fertilizer manufacture and the transport of the fertilizers, can also be included as a food system emission. But they are considered as energy emission and not purely agriculture emissions. So when we talk about the CO2 emissions from agriculture, they're actually lower than there are because they don't account those ones. So energy consumption in agriculture is mainly driven by diesel and fertilizer use, followed by electricity use. Let me give you an example. In order to produce 1 kilogram of nitrogen fertilizer, we need about 36,000 kilojoules of energy, which is actually a liter of fuel. And we release in the atmosphere about 2.38 kilograms of carbon dioxide. So for a hypothetical British farm, very small, 100 hectares, in order to grow 100 hectares of cereals, and let's say we apply 200 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year, we need 200,000 liters of fuel, and we release in the atmosphere 47,000 kilograms of CO2, just for one wheat crop for 100 hectares of cereals. Ammonia production. We all know that ammonia, like fertilizers, nitrogen fertilizers and ammonia produced with a Haber-Bosch process. So ammonia production, which is the mainly stage of production of nitrogen fertilizers, yield about 50% of the protein for that humans require today. So we can argue that the world population since the early 20th century, it's actually largely sustained by this availability of fixed nitrogen by this Haber-Bosch process. And you can see in the second figure that I have here in this slide that the world population grew by 135% over those years. And this is closely correlated with the nitrogen availability. However, I need to also point out that we also grow crops in order to feed animals. So in the first figure, you will see that there is a bit of inefficiency in the nitrogen used in the system because we actually, use the nitrogen to grow crops to feed animals and especially producing meat from cattle. The other mineral is phosphorus. It's a very critical element for modern agriculture. Phosphorus is a non-renewable source. It's actually a mining mineral. We mine it from phosphate strips. And 85% of the phosphorus is used for agriculture fertilizers or to produce animal feeds. But there is a slight problem that the phosphorus is quickly running out. 7% of global production is currently produced from reserves, which will be run out. There are many calculations. Many people believe that they will run out in 100 years. Other people are more optimistic. They say that they will run out in 300 years. But we are sure that we are running out of phosphorus. That's the only thing that we are sure. And this will result in a significant global production deficit, which by 2070 will be larger than the current production. In UK and in EU, we import all the phosphorus fertilizers. We don't produce phosphorus. And the most known phosphorus deposits are actually North African countries. The biggest producer is Morocco, then it's Algeria, Tunisia, and Egypt. And there are also some significant deposits in USA, in Russia, and China. But let's think about the current geopolitical situations nowadays, especially with the war in Ukraine. How secure is our phosphorus supply? If we have a war in one of those North African countries, we will completely run out of phosphorus fertilizers. And talking about those geopolitical situations, you all notice that the food that we eat, if you go to the supermarket, actually the food is extremely expensive nowadays. And one of the reasons is that the fertilizer prices have risen nearly 30% since the start of 2022, following last year's 80% increase. So these price increases are driven by many factors like the increase of input costs, distributions in the supply chain, and export restrictions. For example, China is not exporting any fertilizers nowadays because they keep them all for their own production because they're afraid that they will run out. Briefly, fertilizer prices rose in response to the war in Ukraine, as we all know, reflecting the impact of economic sanctions and disruptions in the Black Sea trading routes. Russia accounts for about 16% of the global urea exports and 12% of the phosphate exports. And Russia and Belarus together, they make up to 2/5 of global potassium exports. In addition to this, as I told, China suspended the export of fertilizers until at least the near future in order to ensure their own domestic availability. So all this caused increases in food prices. So to summarize my very brief and very optimistic introduction, high yields in modern farming systems rely on mineral NPK fertilizer inputs. And okay, this is not sustainable. Mineral nitrogen fertilizer manufacture is estimated to account for 10% of total greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. And mineral phosphorus deposit will run out soon. And so the current phosphorus supply is not secure. And without these inputs, the yields will decline by 50%. In addition, all the fertilizers are not cheap anymore. So there is a big question, how we can actually increase or maintain the current productivity while reducing the environmental impact of crop production and deliver future food security. Thinking about this, I consider agriculture as a system. Because it's a system, there are many components. It's a complex. It's a complex system with interactions between its components. So one of the components is the environment, biotic and abiotic, and the other big component, important component, is the crop genotype that we use. The biotic stresses. When I say biotic stresses, I mean about like soil acidity, salinity, alkalinity, drought, water lodging, high temperature, mineral deficiencies or toxicities. And the biotic stresses, such as diseases, pests, weeds, and soil biota, are the main factors that affect plants' growth and their ability to take up and utilize nutrients more efficiently. The system, it's altered by the agronomic practices that farmers use in order to manage the effect of the environment and improve the yields. But we need to have in mind that the agronomic practices that used in farming differ between agronomic systems, and they differ significantly according to the intensity of the system. For example, like agronomic practices are different in conventional systems that are quite intensive or inorganic or lower input food production systems. And this mainly applies to fertilizer management, fertility management, crop protection, and the intensity of crop production. When I talk about intensity, it's actually the crop rotation, the crop sequence. So, in order to address the crop production challenges sustainably, we should utilize multi-scale and systems approaches to agroecosystems, like working with nature, rediscover some of the agronomic techniques that people were using in the past. I usually say that the techniques that my late grandfather might have used in the past. But at the same time, we need to get those techniques and combine them with the best science and the best precision technology that is available to us today. So based on my logical framework for sustainable crop production, briefly, diverse rotations, cover crops, and regular organic matter inputs support a healthy soil that is a foundation to grow crops. It supports this healthy soil of high biological activity, structural stability, suppressiveness to pests and diseases. In addition, the use of suitable crop species, resistant and efficient crop genotypes ensure competitive crops of higher sensory, technical, and nutritional quality. At the same time, the use of mineral fertilizers and chemosynthetic pesticides is balanced. we use them with a plan. While we promote the use of biostimulants, biopesticides, and other beneficial microorganisms. The decision-making process also takes into account the specific crop demands and nutrients that are originated from farm manure and crop residues, as well as we take into account the specific cycles of crops and natural enemies. Also, mixed farming of crops with animals is suggested because it improves the productivity and profitability of the farm, and it reduces the dependency on the external inputs, and reduces financial risks and promotes what we call circular bio-based economy, circular agriculture. Finally, in my logical framework, the use of precision technology is really important. We use precision technology to monitor, predict, as well as provide crops with the amount of inputs and treatments that are needed for a high yield. And this whole improves the financial and environmental sustainability of the system. I need to click the buttons. To summarize from the previous slide, the main approaches available to us are efficient recycling of nitrogen, phosphorus. I will open them all, makes things easier. Efficient recycling of NPK via diverse agronomic management, the use of crop rotations, animal and green manures, communal and domestic organic waste, and something that is really debatable and controversial, but it will be, I think, in the future, we can also recycle human toilet waste or sewage waste. The second pillar for the future is actually to breed or select more efficient, especially nutrient efficient crop genotypes. The third pillar is to reduce the losses by using precision technologies. And the fourth pillar that is also debatable is the reduction of meat, egg, and dairy production and consumption. Because in order to produce animal feed, we grow crops. So I will just go through a few of those pillars. Soil fertility is not just how much nutrients we have in the soil, but is the interaction between the soil biological, chemical, and physical attributes. So the enhanced biological activity improves nutrient cycling and soil structure, while the good soil structure benefits the biological activity. It's a trade-off. For soil, the organic matter, it's central to good soil fertility. And it's central to good soil fertility management and essential for soil fertility. Organic matter maintains good physical conditions, such as soil structure, aeration, and water holding capacity. It also contains most of the soil reserve of nitrogen and large proportions of other nutrients like phosphorus and sulfur. So while managing the soil organic matter, the short-term target is to supply sufficient nutrients to the crop at the correct point in this development to achieve economically viable yields, while the long-term target is to balance inputs and offtakes of nutrients to avoid nutrient leaching or environmental pollution. The second pillar, we use rotations, crop sequence. While using rotations to improve nutrient management, there are two phases. The first phase, we call it the fertility building phase, where we actually grow legumes to add nitrogen into the system. But after the fertility building phase, we use it's the cash cropping phase, where high nutrient demanding crops are grown first. Always when we plan a rotation, the last crop is usually the low nutrient demanding crop because there is not much fertility left in the soil. And then we start from the beginning. Just a few things like, we can alternate deep rooting and shallow rooting crops. And we always keep the soil covered with catch crops, that there are crops that are grown to take up excess nitrogen after a main crop harvest, or with cover crops, that there are actually crops that they are grown to protect the soil from wind and water erosion. And in a good rotation plan, the use of water-soluble, like mineral nutrients, is kept to a minimum. And we use it precisely just in order to boost productivity. Why? The composted manures are used to redistribute the nutrients around the farm, the circular economy that I told before, and improve soil's fertility and organic matter. So when I talk about composted manures, what is compost and what is composting? Many people get confused because compost is also a soil that we use in horticulture. So when I talk about composts, I'm actually talking about composted animal manures, sludge, slurries, and plant materials that are broadcasted or incorporated into the soil. And these are used as fertilizer replacements, mainly for low input and organic systems. Really basic. Compost is actually a stabilized organic matter that is it's underwent an aerobic microbial digestion process. So we're actually heating it up to 50 degrees, but this is done by microbes. So it's an aerobic process during which microorganisms are actually consuming most of biodegradable organic compounds, and a steady state between formation of new biodegradable compounds is being reached. There are various types of feedstocks, like animal waste and food and crop waste products that we can use for composting, and each type contains different amount of total nitrogen, and as well as nitrogen to carbon ratios. Most of the farmers, they use cattle manure, but chicken manure is quite good because the total nitrogen content is quite high compared to the rest. So summarize this, by using compost in agriculture, we are actually recycling organic waste, and we are actually reducing the waste that is going to the landfill, and by this we are actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Composting eradicates human, animal, and plant pathogens and weed seeds, so it's actually healthy. It has a slow nutrient release pattern that it's believed that it matches the plant demand. It's improving soil structures and biological activity, as I told before. There are studies that have been shown that they're actually also decreasing some soil diseases, soil-borne diseases. And it's actually cheap, especially if you are a mixed farmer and you also have an animal production unit in your farm. You are actually recycling your own waste, and you fertilize your plants and improve your soils. However, there are problems. Nothing is ideal. Like in this graph, it's like an experiment that we ran over 6 years. We grow potatoes with compost and mineral fertilizer, providing the same nitrogen rate, about 180 kilograms of nitrogen. But you will see that the potato yields in the compost fertilized plots are quite low compared to the mineral fertilized plots. Suggesting that the proportion of available nitrogen to the potato crop from the composted manure, it's actually lower than what it is available for mineral fertilizers. Thinking about this, we go back to the nitrogen cycle, how nitrogen cycle works. So, for example, when we apply 150 kilograms of nitrogen of composted, oops, sorry, I click my button. So when we apply 150 kilograms of nitrogen with composted manure, it contains only 6 kilograms of available nitrogen. When I say available nitrogen, it's actually ammonia and nitrate. It's something that is taken up by plants. And during the growth season, a further 12 kilograms of nitrogen will be mineralized. So we actually provide the same total amount of nitrogen, but only 18 kilograms of nitrogen is available for the plants. That's why the yields are actually quite low. Well, it's well established that the nutrient supply to crops from organic matter inputs is related to microbial mineralization in the soil, and is also dependent on climatic conditions. And just to notice, like many people say, the organic crops are actually, the yields are quite low, less. They go up to 30% less compared to conventional crops. The main reason is actually the fertility. Less available nitrogen for the crops. Another alternative organic waste-based fertilizer, it's biogas. Biogas is actually produced from organic materials, plant and animal products that are broken down by bacteria in an oxygen-free environment. If you see in this picture, I don't know if you can see my sensor. This is the biogas digester. Biogas systems use anaerobic digestion to recycle all these organic materials, turning them into biogas, that is actually energy, and the digestate from this process, it's actually fertilizer. So by using anaerobic digestion, we turn waste into a resource. So instead of sending the waste into the landfill, we can use it to produce energy and fertilizer for our crops. Energy we can actually, like power up or power farm buildings during winter, and the fertilizer to grow our crops. So this is produce a circular economy. So we produce also food fuel, we produce fertilizer. This is also reducing the carbon footprint. And it can also benefit many people, like the local community, the environment, industry, farmers, and the energy sector. Talking about circular economy and waste management, just a really brief introduction that the common waste, natural waste, includes like farm waste, includes slurries and manure. So with circular agriculture practices, we focus on using minimal amounts of external inputs by closing the nutrient cycles, regenerating the soils, minimizing the impact on the environment by keeping the residuals of agricultural biomass and food processing within the food system. So this can be practiced in a wide scale, and it can reduce resource requirements and the ecological footprints of agriculture. It can also reduce the fertilizers that are, the amount of fertilizers that we input in the farms and carbon dioxide emissions. The next pillar is varieties. It's something that I really like. Varieties is my passion. Are crop varieties that we currently use efficient? Are they actually bred in order to use to be efficient at using the resources? Have a really nice picture here. So what I say, probably no. Since most of the crops that we use nowadays were bred at their high nitrogen levels. So this resulted in varieties that are dependent on readily available nitrogen. So they cannot actually don't perform their best under low input environments. Like that's an example that I really like. In wheat production, mineral NPK fertilizers increase the lodging risk. And then, like years ago, semi-drafting genes were introduced to the wheat to reduce the straw length and to reduce the lodging risk. So crop, the straw is not falling down. So it makes easy to harvest. So these genes were introduced to the wheat in order to reduce straw length and the lodging risk. But this gene also affected root systems and nutrient uptake capacity because so plants are sorted and the root system is actually also is not going deep. So that's an example of like we are improving something, but we are destroying something else. So crop varieties can respond to varying systems of fertility management in different ways, and the mechanisms for this uptake of different nutrients from the soil also differ. So one of the key goals of the research community on plant breeding and nutrition is to reduce fertilizer input and to select or breed plants with increased nutrient use efficiency and water use efficiency. So we can actually call it resource use efficiency, nutrient and water use efficiency. So a genotype that is high with high nutrient use efficiency, it's actually able to produce high yields at low environments, at low nitrogen environments. So, for example, in this old piece of research that we did a few years ago, we can see that some older wheat varieties are superior in nitrogen extraction compared to modern ones that were actually breeded under high nitrogen input environments. And these varieties can actually also give like higher, they have high protein content. They go up to 12% because protein is the most important, thing for human nutrition, and also to have a wheat variety that's actually able to make, you are able to make flour and make bread. You need high protein. So these are actually moving. I forgot to remove them. It's the same slide again, but for many crops, significant genetic variation with respect to nitrogen use efficiency has been proved, making selecting and breeding for resistance to nitrogen deficiency stress realistic. So, in order to improve, improving the different compounds of nutrient use efficiency, like the maintenance of photosynthesis under nutrient stress, nutrient uptake abilities, and nutrient utilization capacities, and translocation within the plant, and move it to the final harvestable crop. This will contribute to higher yields and quality under lower input conditions. Also, for low input farming, the adoption of varieties to efficient nutrient use from slow nutrient release organic matter-based fertilizers is also very important. And an important component that is not really considered by plant breeders is that nutrient uptake efficiency of nutrient uptake efficiency of plants can also improve by the capacity of crops to establish and maintain efficient plant growth promoting relationships with natural organisms like bacterial communities and mycorrhizas that they live in the soil close to the root system. So in future plant breeding programs, we should also focus on selecting crops that they have this ability of forming the relationships with these growth promoting microorganisms. And something for the last point, I told that we're actually growing food in order to feed animals, and then we consume the animal products. And I found this in a website. This graph is actually in Chinese, so I don't really know what it says. But as you can see from the graphic illustrations, it's how much corn, how much feed we need in order to produce 1 kilogram of meat and other like animal products. So in order to produce 1 kilogram of meat, like from cattle, we need 11 kilograms of corn. So it is quite high. So it's something like to think like maybe in the future we will have to reduce the meat consumption in order to have enough fertilizers to grow crops for human consumption. So to summarize, efficient we need to have efficient recycling of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and other mined minerals by diverse crop rotations, animal and crop green manures, to use communal and domestic waste, and maybe, recycle human waste. We need to breed more efficient crop genotypes that they perform the best under low input. We need to use all of the best of precision technology that is available to us nowadays in order to apply and actually predict and apply fertilizers, precisely. And maybe we need to reduce the consumption of meat, egg, and dairy products. That's all from me. Who I am? Well, David gave the best introduction, so probably, I don't really need to say, what I'm doing. So that's all from me. And 2 pictures that I really like back from 50s, how journalists actually at 50s were dreaming about future agriculture. So, precision agriculture is not something new. People were dreaming about it back at 50s in America. So I like those pictures and I always have them in my presentation. That's all from me. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Leo, and I'm going to continue now with my presentation. So just to give you a brief introduction to myself, I am Louise Manning and I'm Professor of Sustainable Agri-Food Systems at the University of Lincoln, and I'm also a Director of a family farming business. My topic that I'm going to talk about is fear appeals and whether they work, and what strategies we need to have as businesses to develop and consider climate change and also to become climate smart. When we think of the way that climate change and climate challenges are communicated both to the general public and to businesses, some academics have talked about this concept of atmosphere and creating fear and using language of fear in order to engage with individuals and change behaviour. One academic described it as the practice of conversation or discourse to really get people to think about accelerating implementation of greenhouse mitigation policies. And in order to do that, if you are developing a fear appeal, you have to give signals of peril, Armageddon, extinction, catastrophe. And fear appeals have not just been used around climate change. If I'm old enough to remember the fear appeals that first came out when AIDS was identified in the UK population, and anyone watching this webinar who can remember some of the communication tools that were used at the time, the imagery, the voiceovers were very much around peril, catastrophe, Armageddon. And fear appeals depend on individuals and communities believing that there actually is a threat. So we as individuals, if we are going to react to fear appeals, first of all, we have to believe there is a threat. Then we have to believe it is serious and also salient, that it affects us. But really importantly, it's not just the communication of the problem. We have to be able to identify as individuals, once we perceive that threat as being serious and will affect us or our children or grandchildren, that we can also do something about it. And one of the challenges with climate change is the language that sits around it. If you're a scientist, you use words like mitigation, adaptation all the time, but those words aren't used in everyday language. So when they first appear, they can often be a barrier to individuals, either in their own homes or within businesses, thinking about what they can do and how they can affect change. One of the real examples that academics are looking at right now, where there were fear appeals, were the fear appeals that were used during the COVID-19 pandemic. Those communication approaches that were designed to encourage us and then through legislation to force us to change our behaviour. And some academics were looking at not only the fear appeals, whether they worked, how they worked, what tactics were used, but also the negative impacts. And Stolo et al. Produced a paper in June 2020 where they were looking at evidence-based health communication. And we can see health communications that are based on the problem and how it affects us. But it's really important that we think about fear appeals and we don't just identify the problem as a serious threat, but we also think about what will be the impact on individuals if they take up that behavior. Because if individuals feel that taking up the behavior will have a more adverse effect on them as individuals than the threat they perceive, they will not change their behavior. What we saw in Stoller's work in June 2020 was they cautioned around fear appeals that would change people's behavior, and also the additional stresses that that would give. And when we think of a pandemic and we think of the restrictions, especially when so much was unknown, we can think about those potential unanticipated impacts. And Solo et al. Talk about those unintended consequences of fear appeals, of saying that Armageddon is coming, or we face climate extinction with the climate subject that I'm talking about today. And they cite behaviors such as denial, backlash, avoidance, defensiveness, stigmatization of particular groups, and also how it affects us as individuals, especially if we feel we have a lack of control or our lives force us to feel that we're unable to take action. And perceiving the seriousness of the problem of climate change depends on where you are. So this photograph is of a smallholder in Kenya, and how climate change is perceived in this location will be very different to a megacity somewhere in Asia, or indeed how you would perceive the problem of climate change if you live in the UNESCO biosphere of North Devon. And one of the key aspects we have to think about when we are seeking to communicate about climate change is how is the communication interacting with our lived experience? Because if we do not modify our communications so that we address the seriousness of the problem, how it could affect us in our lived experience, and that we are capable of changing behavior, then we will still see what we see right now of little change towards addressing our emissions across the planet. And the question of salience of that climate threat is to who and what and when. And this is a picture that was taken of the forest fires in California. We can all look at this picture, which captures so many different aspects of concern and threat around climate. And we will all take, everyone on this webinar will all take different thoughts away from this severe environmental challenge. And we are seeing a number of events that are happening around the planet where we as individuals are thinking, how does that affect me as an individual, and what is the degree of threat? Or there is communication and discourse that sits around it that we are reading, where we are seeing others' perspective of the threat of climate change. So how do we tackle the challenge of climate change? And how do we begin to engage with people to believe that they can make a difference? And in this next part of the presentation, I'm going to focus very clearly on farming, landscape management, and food businesses. The photograph that I've got on the slide is of Lake Vunri. If you were to go to this location in the 1700s, it would have looked completely different. But when we had our Industrial Revolution, an Industrial Revolution we see happening today in many parts of the world, there was a real threat of lack of water in many of the major northern cities that were growing. And this was our policy and our reaction. Our reaction was to build reservoirs, to store water, and then move that water quite some distance, relatively in the UK. But when I am farming in this location today, I'm thinking of climate threat equally to a whole range of other threats. When I talk to farmers about climate and their potential role in making their business more resilient and in potentially offsetting some of the impact of other businesses on the planet. They will say to me, my first immediacy is my cash flow for the next week, the next month. Then I'm thinking about, am I going to make a profit from the various activities on my farm? Then, as Leo so eloquently explained, there's that whole system that fits around my business. I'm also thinking about biodiversity. So I have a whole range of issues and a whole range of potential threats to my business this week, this month, this year, in the next 10 years to the next generation that I am considering as a farmer. Which ones do I address first? Have I got the resources to be able to address all of those threats that I'm now facing? One opportunity I had in 2019 was to visit the net zero beef farm that Embraca are developing as a research farm in Brazil. And here is a photograph of the cattle. One of the aspects of the net zero beef farm was to consider the farm as a system. How could they grow and how could they sequester enough carbon on that farm to then offset the potential emissions from the cattle? But more so, how could they look at how they could provide tree cover, how they could manage their forage to be able to promote not only productivity, a reduction of net emissions, but also to address animal welfare? How could they reduce the potential for heat stress, for example? And what's not in this photograph, but was literally about 500 meters away from where I took this photograph, was where they were producing charcoal and biochar, all in one system that was important for that particular location on the planet. And one of the challenges we have when we look at climate is it has to, with our solutions, have to be relevant to the location where our business is. But it was a really interesting opportunity to see how both in Brazil, they were looking at net zero carbon meat, but also in Australia, they now have net zero carbon meat on the shelves. Do I believe I can do something? Well, for many people, they believe they can do something by not eating meat or reducing the amount of meat and animal products that they are consuming in a given week. So our food supply chain and food markets are seeking to provide alternatives and also convenient alternatives. But do I believe I can do something extends far more, whether it's a business or as an individual, beyond what is easily accessible, such as just changing what you put in your trolley in the supermarket. But I have to believe I can do something about the threat. I have to believe that it fits within my business model or my farming system. So how does communicating about a problem alone drive change? And I go back to health when I think of communicating the problem. And here we see the incidence of severe obesity in England from 1993 to 2019. And these figures do not include, and I've not been able to find figures yet to look at the impact of the 2020-2021 COVID lockdown on the obesity rates and how that might have changed. But these figures show that despite lots of communication, despite lots of information about the personal challenges of obesity, we still see a continued rise. Now that tells me that this is a complex issue. And if we were to look at how people have changed their diets at a whole range of ages to address maybe eating less meat or transitioning their diets, we see that there is a delayed response in that too, apart from certain elements of our community. So fear appeals don't work when they only focus on the problem, or when we perceive that potential measures proposed are either unpalatable, anything from I wouldn't eat that to I just couldn't do that within my business, or unachievable. Whether they are more risky than not taking action, or when we do not trust either the message or the person providing that message. But we do have a crisis with our climate. We do have, and if you go onto the Hawaii website, you can see every day in Hawaii how the CO2 levels relate to the day before and how they relate to years gone by. And we can see that we do have a climate crisis. And if we look at the large multinational governance groups that are looking at climate, what is being demonstrated clearly is we cannot carry on with business as usual. Where the diversity becomes what do the emerging business models look like? And the question that can arise is, can we transition incrementally, so we do a bit each year, or are we at the stage right now, and it'd be interesting in COP27 to see what the views are a year on from COP26. Do we need a real disruption to drive change so that we can transition our businesses and our lives? It's important to think that disruption can cover a wide range of activities. We can have disruption via regulation, where it becomes compulsory to change your business or your behavior. The market, institutions, community action can be disruptive. But what I want to focus on is 4 other aspects. Disruptive products, and I showed you the example of the plant-based foods, and that's one area where we're seeing a lot of development to provide individuals with choice over the kinds of products that they consume. Disruptive technology, and Leo talked about precision agriculture, and here at LIAT we are doing a whole range of research looking at disruptive technology. Disruptive thinking, where we are looking at our businesses and we are introducing new kinds of thinking into our businesses so that we can become more resilient and more climate smart. And disruptive leadership, where is the leadership that's not only identifying the problems but demonstrating the solutions to those challenges. And climate change will create vulnerability for all of our businesses. And in many parts of the world, they are seeing that right now. And that impact will vary depending on the business, depending on if we're talking about farms, different enterprises. But we need to consider already the short, medium, and long-term impact of climate change. Being climate smart and having climate smart businesses requires investment. It requires investment in people, ideas, and innovation. And one of the challenges for many farming businesses right now is to look at their balance sheet and their financial balance sheet and to say, how can I drive that level of investment? And many conversations I've had with food businesses are, well, where do you begin? If you're going to invest in the people, the ideas and innovation in your business, where will you get the best return? Where will you start this journey towards being more resilient and more climate smart. And I'm talking about business management as equally as I am the practices on farm. The real challenge is that what it takes to be climate smart, if we look at next year's crop cycle, if we look at the next 5 years, the next 10 years, if we then add in all the policy changes that could occur, what it is to be climate smart today will change over time. And if we are in a disruptive sector, we could invest in innovation and technology, even ideas today that could be obsolete in the medium term. And for anyone who's invested, for example, in renewables over the last 20, 25 years, there are some stories where the innovation has remained of value to your business. There are others where you can invested and then 5 years, 10 years later, that investment has become obsolete. So if we're thinking of climate smart food chains, we need to think about how we strengthen our supply chains in order for them to be more resilient and less vulnerable. We have to think about how we are producing food and how we get societal engagement and approval of the activities that we are undertaking and the new innovations that we are bringing in. We need to communicate more about what we're doing on our farms to capture carbon, to embed that into a holistic system within our businesses. We need to enable investment, and we need to be able to access all kinds of green investment, for example, as businesses in farms and in the supply chain. We need to increase employment and business growth. Sorry, I'm on. Sorry. Sorry. And I'm just going to end with giving you some examples from a project I did quite recently for British Apples and Pears, where we looked at what are farmers doing today from orchard to eating experience to look at being more sustainable in terms of apple and pear production. As time is limited, I'm just going to give you an insight, but you can go and read the whole report on the British Apple and Pears Limited website. The questions we asked are, what are the emergent innovations that will create a step change, that disruption for the better in the top fruit sector? And how can these innovations be adopted in a way that captures economic, environmental, and social value for those businesses? So one of the businesses we looked at was James Smith's business at Loddington Farm, where James had gone back to the farm after having undertaken an Nuffield scholarship and looked at how could he change his farm with the goal of being chemical free within 5 years. And how could he build this into a holistic model on his farm? We looked at how technology was being developed and how developing a digital twin of the orchards with the use of a whole range of technology and predictive and diagnostic tools could be used to optimize yields, fruit quality, and to make sure that you could use all of these tools to be the best farmers that you could be, or growers that you can be. But to have some very clear goals that in better, in optimizing yield, in managing resources efficiently, that automatically had an impact in reducing the water footprint and the carbon footprint of the business. So being climate smart is about focusing on your entire business balance sheet. And I've talked very much an overview around financial capital, physical capital, human capital, social capital, but also what for any farming business is essential, natural capital. And this means that we have to create business solutions to be climate smart that relate specifically to the businesses. So, for any business that is in this business breakfast today, what are the things that you can take away from the presentation? How can you go back to your business and think about how you can look at your business and where you can improve resource efficiency, where you can innovate to be more climate smart as a business? Thank you for listening, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Louise, and also thank you, Leo, for those two fascinating talks. One, a very broad Louise's talk, overview of the topic, sustainability and climate, and how it impacts globally, but also Leo's in terms of perhaps understanding, if you like, the biology and the crop science behind that. And I think it's always fascinating to see how those things come together. There are a number of questions. I'm going to take some of the questions first, and then I'll come back with a few comments and thoughts as well. So I think if we start off, Toby raised the issue. I'm going to just wait for Leo to get his headphones on. So Toby raised the issue around biosolids and the use of biosolids as an alternative. I think in the UK, certainly from my understanding, we do already use a lot of biosolids, but they're constrained by legislation and how we can use them. But Leo, would you like to comment on the use of biosolids and whether you think more could be done with biosolids, so i.e. waste from human sewage, to put it pleasantly?
My microphone was muted. Yeah, the main problem of using like human waste as fertilizer is it's what humans believe. I don't think that, you know, like if you say someone that, you know, the food that is, you know, you will eat, it was grown with human waste. It's actually the public perception. Because, you know, it is visible. Like, for example, in America, there are actually plants that are actually cleaning the water, and they irrigate the plants with wastewater from you know, human sewage treatment. So for me, like the main issue is actually, you know, like how to make sure that all these materials are actually clean and safe for people, and actually how to convince people that, you know, the food that you are actually eating, it's healthy. Because imagine, you know, thinking that, you know that, you know, your toilet waste is actually used to grow plants. Who will eat this food? Actually, to me, that's the main issue is this: convince people, because the technology nowadays is so advanced that we can actually have a safe product.
Louise, did you want to come in on that? Because
so for me, it's not necessarily the human waste itself. It's the microplastics and nanoplastics that are present in sewage sludge, and I think there needs to be urgent research that looks at there's some work that's coming out around the uptake of plants in terms of microplastics and nanoplastics. But we need to accelerate that research because it is a potential significant human issue. But microplastics and nanoplastics don't just come from sewage; they're coming from a whole range of potential sources. So human sewage has been used on farms for millennia as a source of nutrient, but it was human sewage. What we have that leaves our megacities now has a whole lot of other things in it, as well as human sewage. So I think we need to think about that too.
Yeah, and I think for those of us who are involved in produce in the 90s, I think some of the challenges were around disease contamination, so spread of human diseases. But I think a lot of the controls are in place in terms of what you're allowed to put on and how you do it. Yeah. So, and Toby's just commented that they already use 3.5 million tons, but if my understanding is correct, it's specific to which crops systems you can utilize it on. and therefore it's perhaps more focused. I think just I wanted to pick up on one other thing related to waste, if you like, and putting waste back onto land. Leo, you talked about using animal waste, and in a similar way, but clearly within the UK environment, we have quite a separation of a lot of the animal production from cereals production. They're in different parts of the country. So how do you create that more balanced system approach when you have quite disparate specialized farming units that have been created, certainly within the UK context?
Yeah, that's an issue. If if you are not a mixed farmer and the animal farm is far away from the crop farming enterprises, it is a problem. But the distribution system needs to work better and have exchanges, like give benefits to the people. Like for example, the animal farmers can actually get feed from the crop farmers, and the crop farmers in exchange can get fertilizers or all the waste. Because if you are like only an animal farmer, this is waste for you. You don't know where to actually put this. If you are a crop farmer, you need it. So if the system is built in such a way, they can actually distribute those materials around the country. But ideally, you need to have it needs to be quick. It needs to be close, because it's also the cost of distributing those materials.
So if you're a large-scale livestock producer in the UK, you will need to have an environmental permit to operate. So I'm thinking of poultry and pigs. All the time that manure is inside your poultry houses, it is under the restrictions of environmental permits, which are routinely verified by the Environment Agency. The minute that manure leaves those units, then we fall under different controls. What's really interesting in areas where there are concerns with diffuse pollution and with a high intensity of, for example, poultry production, there is a lot of work now looking at anaerobic digestion and biorefineries. And I think the government needs to urgently invest in looking at research around anaerobic digestion and biorefineries, because we can produce pelletized nutrients for crop farmers if we've got the research, and we can biorefine a whole range of materials from manures, but also other outputs that are produced on farm. So there is work that's going on to be able to move it from the west to the east of the UK. But also we're seeing a lot of arable farmers that are looking to link with sheep producers to overwinter sheep on their farms, which I think is an interesting development too.
Okay, thanks, Louise. I'm going to now move away from biosolids to there was some questions around varieties, Leo, around wheat varieties, and whether there are varieties coming along which are more efficient at nutrient uptake. If you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, every year the varieties that they come in the list are better than the previous ones. But like the majority of the varieties, they still need loads of nitrogen, especially nitrogen input, in order to produce the best. And breeding for low input agriculture is something new. They're mainly focused in, I don't think that there is a breeding program in UK for low input agriculture, and the majority of the programs are actually funded by EU. And currently there are 4 European projects that are actually trying to breed for low input systems, and mainly for nitrogen and phosphorus use efficiency. But the modern varieties that we have, all the breeding targets, they usually focus on disease resistance mainly. Still, all about nitrogen use efficiency started 10 years ago, the efforts. Even in the list, if you go to the national lists, nitrogen is nowhere. They say about septoria resistance, rust resistance, but the farmer is not really able to know if the variety is actually, able to perform the best with lower inputs.
Okay.
So whatever is done is only for organic farming, and that's in a smaller scale because the sector is quite small.
Okay, so clearly an opportunity.
And it's an opportunity for everybody. Like 10 years ago, when I was working in the New Crops project, people were saying why EU is investing those money for this small organic sector. But now that the fertilizer prices are up on the roof, it is an important component of the system.
So coming back to Louise's point about fear may not be a driver of change, but perhaps economics and the economic value of fertilizer is likely to drive more change more quickly. Although I appreciate breeding is a historically slow process. So sorry, Leo. Yeah, so I think thank you for that. And also, do you want to just comment on the Karthik's question around monitoring? I know we've got a rhizome, a flux tower looking at carbon, and I know there is some developments around nitrogen monitoring. That's new sensors that have come out by through some Innovate funded research, I believe. But do you want to comment further if there's any other things that we could do or people could be doing?
Well, what I was talking about is actually the energy used in order to produce the fertilizers. Let me give me a second because I messed up my comment box.
Oh, don't worry. Okay, I'll let you go and look for that, and then I'll perhaps come back to. I'll ask Louise a quick question. So, Louise, do you want to just comment? So, you've talked about some of the drivers being around people's decision making, and there's a comment from Jonathan around reducing meat. So, do you think that is something that people should do, or is it? Are there other opportunities and other ways of tackling the problem?
So the challenge for anyone who's looking to change their behaviour is the difference between emissions and net zero. And some business models are being developed that are zero emissions. So the farms and the supply chains that they're supplying into are looking at how can we produce meat, dairy products as equally as crops, that because of the other activities we're undertaking on our farm, we are insetting on our farm, not offsetting. We're insetting on our farm, and as a result, we can clearly demonstrate that this meat has been produced in a holistic system where overall there are zero emissions because we can sequester in hedgerows, in grassland or in trees. The challenge becomes that there are very few tools that farmers can use, if any, that look at the whole carbon cycle of their farm. There are tools that can help you to reduce emissions, but in terms of being able to identify how much carbon you're sequestering and how you can change activities on your farm to sequester more carbon, there is very limited information. And that's a real challenge for farmers right now. We in the food industry, if we are land-based, are the only sector in the world that sequesters carbon right now, unless there is a real disruptive technology. Other industries note we sequester carbon and would like to offset their business as usual by purchasing our carbon. I think it's really important that farmers think clearly about whether they do that, because there is the opportunity to demonstrate that in the right production system, that meat can be net zero on a given farm. I think we ought to be looking much more holistically at carbon rather than just focusing on emissions.
Okay. So do you believe that farmers should be paid a premium, therefore, if that's the right way of describing it, for producing net zero, or that they should get some other taxation benefit? Is that because clearly, if you're a farmer, whilst you may have a desire to do better, that if there isn't an economic value to that, are you likely to do it? So is the barrier for farmers adopting these technologies and the practices the fact that there isn't currently no economic value add for those businesses, and therefore to change that, do you need to either change the taxation system or create some way of creating a premium for those products?
I would say that, and I have a livestock farming business,
Yeah.
that in improving your soil, in being able to improve the nutrients and micronutrients, and we haven't talked about micronutrients today in your soil. If you are producing better grass, you will have better conception rates. You will be able to support more livestock per hectare or per acre, or you will be able to then have certain land on your farm which is not productive, that you can potentially provide ecosystem services. I think one of the areas that we don't talk about is that one particular field is giving multiple benefits. The work that's going on around silver pasture, the work that's, and I'll go back to sheep again, the work that's going on around certain trees like willow and the benefits of, in terms of micronutrients, looking at hedgerows and looking at the diversity of swards so they're more resilient to drought, but also are providing micronutrients or alternative food for livestock. All of these things will make you more profitable. And I think a business needs to look at that. Going back to the work I did with British Apples and Pears, looking at that sustainable value for your business, economic value, social value, and environmental value. So waiting for somebody external to your business to give you some money, or doing something in your business because you're going to be taxed if you don't, creates a diverse thinking that doesn't go back to that holistic thinking for, and I'm talking about farming businesses now, the holistic thinking for the farming business.
Very interesting answer, Louise. I'm sure we could spend hours debating the political and pressures and decision making that affects farmers, but a really interesting take. So I think my take out from that is, if you're doing the right things to the environment, those will bring financial benefits in the long term to your farming business, and therefore actually it's in your own self-interest to do those things in the long term financially.
The challenge is finding the people who have the skill sets to be able to look at your farm in that detail, to be able to say, these are the additional micronutrient licks you need for your sheep in these fields. These are where you're deficient. This is how you might have to think about whether you finish lambs or you sell them as stores. Leo's talked about low input farming, and livestock, it's the same. Can you reduce your vulnerability by reducing your costs? And we could talk for hours about different farming systems, different risks, different returns, but all of these things farmers need to think about as the environment in which they farm changes.
Brilliant. Thanks, Louise. I'm going to just come back to Leo. Did you manage to establish the answer to Karthik's question? And then I'm gonna.
Yeah, I found the question actually. I was looking at the wrong. I was looking at the private chat instead of the comments. So Karthik is actually asking about, like monitoring, how we can actually monitor and measure emissions in the farm. And there are actually devices that they can measure ammonia and nitrous oxide emissions. And there are also experiments worldwide that are trying to figure out if different fertility inputs, if they cause different emissions. So yes, to answer, his question is, there is technology around that we can actually measure it without using the theoretical calculations. And
Brilliant.
we have the matrixome, as far as I know.
Yeah, no, we have the carbon flux tower, and I believe we're
Yeah.
trying to get the nitrogen sensors as well. So which will be great. Okay, well, I think we haven't had any new questions for a few minutes, so I think unless anybody's got any burning questions quickly to put into the chat, I'm going to thank our speakers, Louise and Leo, for their contributions. I hope it's stimulated some thought and debate amongst our listeners and viewers. And I'd like to thank Louise and Leo for their contributions. If you have been listening and would like to get in touch with the team, please drop us a line. We are always happy to talk to farmers, to businesses who are looking to progress knowledge and understanding in these areas. We have open days as well, which we'll be running again, and we'll be running these talks through the rest of the winter. So really appreciate and thank you very much for listening, and hope you'll join our next talk in about a month's time. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.